Neofolk is a style of music that has intrigued me for a handful of years now, and I've done videos about it before here on my channel in the past, but with this video I really want to go in a more deep dive cut to truly understand the history and impact that makes Neofolk what it is. For those who are unaware, Neofolk is a subgenre of music that blends the very organic and natural sounds of folk music with its stringed instrumentation with the very unnatural and synthetic sounds of experimental, electronic, and industrial. Thus, when they're melded together, you get this massive juxtaposition of music genres being played simultaneously. It's also worth mentioning that prior to this genre being called Neofolk, for a short while during the late 80s and early 90s, it was often characterized as apocalyptic folk by none other than David Tibet from Current 93, which obviously I'll be talking to you about him later on in this video. But the reason why this genre tag is just so blunt is that when you listen to really any Current 93 album during this time period, along with really any project that David Tibet was a part of during the same time period, is that the lyrical themes and overall tone of these albums are obviously dark and very morbid-like in nature, borrowing a lot of themes from Gnostic and thelemic viewpoints and having this sense of this apocalypse is upon us. And especially when you listen to how David Tibet sings, which I'll get into that as well later on in this video, is that there's more of this preacher and narration that the end of times is coming, and it's more of this presentation that really adds to the overall apocalyptic folk genre tag that it's going for. Along with the fact too that I've also noticed that the tag of just straight up dark folk tends to be another genre tag that people label it under, again mainly just having to do with the overall themes and vibe that you're getting from the music. But before I get into the beginnings of Neofolk, I want to trace it back even further decades prior to what was the harbingers and really the origins and understanding of folk music as we see it today, or at least back during the 20th century. You see, folk music is a very old style of music that's really embedded in forms of traditionalism in the musical sense anyway. Because technically, folk music has been around before recording albums was even a thing, stretching back centuries ago. But what I'm talking about here in terms of the modern sense of folk music for this video anyway, is I'm primarily looking at when folk music was being recorded and released to the public. One of the earliest examples of modern folk, if you will, would come from Woody Guthrie, the individual behind the song This Land Is Your Land, that released a plethora of music during his time when he was alive, that what he really started establishing, at least for the essence of what folk music would become, is it's very simplistic, having just one individual singing while also playing an acoustic guitar, really just relying on, harmonies and melodies of that acoustic guitar and his singing to really just be the driving force of everything that you would hear. Thanks to Woody Guthrie's contributions to music, it would influence a whole new generation to come of artists from all different styles of music, such as Johnny Cash, who would become really big within country music, Lou Reed, who would become really a huge icon within art rock and more in the realms of like experimental music, and of course Bob Dylan, who is a really big name when it comes to more of the accessible approaches to folk music. What's interesting about pointing all this out is when you look at all of the artists that were influenced by Woody Guthrie within the realms at least of rock or country, is that they deeply expanded upon those styles of music, adding in different other forms of music, different instrumentation, and different approaches that really added so much more and expanded upon it greatly. Yet when you look at all the artists that were influenced by Woody Guthrie in the region of folk music, they really didn't expand upon it anymore. If anything, they really kept true to its original take, and really this is where I state now that folk music is deeply rooted in more of the traditional sense musically. And it would be like that for folk music for quite a couple of decades. That is until we reach the late 60s and early 70s, where folk music's overall approach gets shaken up a little bit. I know I bring this up a lot, and I never seem to have like a definitive answer as to why this is, but during the late 60s and early 70s, there was just so much experimentation happening everywhere within music. I don't know if it was because people were taking certain drugs, or there were certain variables that I'm not putting into perspective here in terms of what was happening around the world, but again, during this time of late 60s and early 70s, being experimental and trying new things within really any genre of music was just so much more approachable, and was happening a lot more often than not. And in folk music, this is to where now we get within the realm or the genre tag known as freak folk. So what is freak folk? In short, it's a branch off of psychedelic folk that was happening during the exact same time period. What makes this so substantial is for the first time within folk music, people are finally experimenting. It isn't so deeply rooted in that traditional sense of how it started out. Now we're having elements of psychedelia involved with folk music. People are singing a bit differently and freakish-like in nature, and it's finally starting to expand its sound more, and the elements of experimentation and creativity are being more nourished now. What's often considered to be the godmother to freak folk would be Vashti Bunyan with her full-length album, Just Another Diamond Day. An incredible album that I would recommend to anyone, regardless if you like folk music or not. And what's interesting about this album is even though Vashti Bunyan has never claimed to be a folk musician, nor was she aware of the micro-genre known as freak folk, it doesn't change the fact that her influence and impact on this style of music is still quite relevant, because to be honest with you, what this sounds like in terms of the instrumentation, composition, overall vibe, it gives me this vision of like, what if Chelsea Wolfe were to make an album in the 1970s? This is what it would sound like. Because even though instrumentally it's really rooted within like folk music with its stringed arrangements, it's really the standout feature of Vashti's vocals that I really think is quite significant here. Because what it sounds like, it's really tender and sweet in the nature of if a mother were to sing a nursery rhyme to her infant. It's just her execution and vibe, I can't help but feel like there's these dark undertones with how she sings that kind of aligns with the whole like freak folk nature. Then of course I need to mention Comus with their debut full-length album from 1971, First Utterance. An album way ahead of its time that plays more in the style of progressive folk and of course freak folk. And what makes this album just so incredible, not only for 1970 standards, but for today's standards, is just how off the rails this album gets from every moment you're listening to. There is so much happening, but it's all composed, and the stringed instrumentation and arrangements are just so captivating. I feel like I'm in this nightmare that just never ends. It's like as if there's something chasing me in this really dense, deep, dark woods that I just wish it would kind of end, but it never does. How this album was released in 1971 and how they came up with the ideas for this album, again, is truly incredible. And just like Vashti Bunyan, I would strongly recommend this to anyone who just enjoys music, regardless if you're into folk or not. But again, this is another really vital album in terms of the development and a harbinger for neofolk, because it just started adding in so many different components. I also want to credit Exuma, which I know I'm getting a little bit off topic here for, neofolk and really spending more time with freak folk, but Exuma is often ignored, I feel like, and whenever it's brought up, it's often compared to Comus, which is a little bit odd, but also understandable, because even though they're completely different, they were like the only two like freak folk groups from the 70s that had a lot of these like dark and twisted themes attached with it. It's just with Comus, it was way more rooted in progressive folk and more of like this nightmarish type of folklore aspect, where Exuma is, again, still deeply rooted in that nightmarish freak folk aspect, only now there's a lot more elements of soul music being attached with it, and the vibe is a lot more voodoo influenced, I would say, and it is just so good. And again, I feel like it's so underappreciated. Regardless if people credit it or not as one of these harbingers for neofolk, I could care less. It's just, I feel like I need to bring these guys up because for people really diving more into freak folk, Exuma, I do feel like is a must-know, and again, it's a damn shame that no one ever talks about it. It's also worth mentioning all these psychedelic folk albums that were coming out during this time by certain artists and bands, such as Donovan with his album Sunshine Superman, Pearls Before Swine with their album One Nation Underground, and the Incredible String Band with their album The Hangman's Beautiful Daughter. Again, encompassing forms of psychedelia into their folk instrumentations that would almost get into forms of like acid folk, if you will, that would just be a lot more experimental and more of this trippy sense that was really unorthodox for its time for the style of music. And the last inclusion that I want to give in terms of influences and a harbinger for what neofolk was going to become, again within the realms of the 70s freak folk scene, I know this is kind of a bit of an odd choice, but I would really credit the Wicker Man film and soundtrack. So I really do believe Wicker Man being this folk horror film during the early 70s that was brought into theaters and given a more, dare I say, mainstream audience appeal with its forms of neo-paganism, with its overall story arc and themes that were brought to it. And the overall soundtrack is just so weird for folk music. How there's children singing within it, or all of the kind of like stringed instruments of guitars and violins being played over everything, to even Christopher Lee singing on this album. It just embodies what freak folk and all these like psychedelic, lush folk albums were kind of doing during this time period, that I really do feel like the Wicker Man film and its soundtrack should be credited here in some sense for being a harbinger for neofolk. Now, fast forward an additional decade to the early 1980s, and of course this is where industrial music starts becoming a thing. A style of music that I brought up numerous times before whenever I talk about the origins of music, such as dark ambient music. I brought this up before, and I'm not going to bother wasting my breath as to who are some of the pioneers for industrial music. Just know that industrial music plays a vital role here within the timeline of neofolk, because as I stated earlier, neofolk is a mixture of folk and forms of electronic and industrial all blended together. And it's during this time period, the early 1980s, where we start seeing some of our first real true examples of what apocalyptic folk and neofolk was going to become. Obviously, there are two certain groups that I'll be talking about very shortly in this video that are huge pioneers to the style of music, both of which you can see on screen right now. But what I would argue is the very first true example of neofolk, again blending folk and industrial music together, would come from Psychic TV with their debut full-length album, Force the Hand of Chance. This album is often characterized as some left-field avant-garde post-punk, which, make no mistake about it, that is the majority of the influence and styles you will hear on this. But the reason as to why I consider it to be the first true example of neofolk is that industrial and forms of acoustic instrumentation that resembles folk is strongly present throughout it. Take into consideration that Peter Christopherson is a part of Psychic TV during this time, as he does all the electronics, percussions, and I believe even some of the production value on this album. And if you are unaware, Peter Christopherson is a significant name when it comes to really anything to do with electronic and industrial music, as obviously he was a part of Psychic TV for a few years. He was also part of Throbbing Gristle, and of course after he disbanded from Psychic TV, he started Coil, which is a monumental project when it comes to anything to do with industrial and post-industrial. And yes, one day down the road, I definitely want to do a video all about Coil. Add to the fact that David Tibet is also a part of this album. He's a special guest vocalist throughout it. And even Mark Allman from Soft Cell has a special guest appearance on vocals, which I always thought was pretty cool on it. While the argument can be made that it isn't truly neo-folk per se, because it does have industrial and acoustic folk instrumentation being played here, they're not really blended together per se, as some songs just have all the industrial and post-punk sections. Other songs are the acoustic instrumentation of folk music that's more of like these interlude tracks between the album that, again, they're not mixed entirely together. So I understand that argument. For me personally, you could almost say it's like proto-neo-folk if you want to get even more technical, but I've always considered it to be the first example of neo-folk, because this is really the first album that I've really come across where these styles of music are both present on an album. But in any case, for what many understand as to be the real true pioneers that really establish our understanding of neo-folk as it is today, would obviously come from Douglas P. from Death in June and David Tibet from Current 93. What I find so interesting about these two is that they're both considered to be the big pioneers to that of neo-folk, yet when you look at how they are as musicians, they're so incredibly, vastly different between each other. For starters, look at Douglas P. from Death in June. He started up more in the region of the punk rock scene in the UK during the mid to late 70s, heavily influenced by bands like The Clash and Sex Pistols, and this is where he started up the punk rock band Crisis for a handful of years. Shortly after Crisis disbanded, immediately the members started up Death in June, only Death in June was more of a band and not so much a one-man project as we know today. And when you listen to the first albums by Death in June, such as The Guilty Have No Pride, Burial, and Nada, you'll notice instrumentally it's not so much rooted in neo-folk, but way more rooted in forms of post-punk. Something that I would always characterize as it's more of like this occultish and militarized version of Joy Division. And when you look at the body of work that David Tibet was doing with Current 93 during this time, it was completely devoid of any forms of folk and way more rooted in industrial. Take, for example, some of the early Current 93 albums like Nature Unveiled and Dog's Blood Rising that are just straight up industrial noise and dark ambient albums. It's also worth mentioning that David Tibet was also working with a lot of music projects that were way more in the region of experimentation and like abstract forms of music, such as Nurse with Wound and, as I stated earlier, Psychic TV. Hence why when you compare the two in terms of their musical execution, it's so vastly different when you look at their background. See, when you listen to a lot of the neo-folk albums by Death in June, Douglas Pierce's approach is way more rhythmic and has a lot more hooks to it, mainly having to do with the fact that forms of punk rock with its overall pacing is obviously applied with some of his guitar playing work on Death in June albums. Thus, I've always looked at it when we compare Death in June to Current 93, Death in June is way more accessible on the audio standpoint because it has more of the familiar sense of what we're accustomed to hearing in music. There's more melodies, there's more hooks, the singing is a lot more harmonic. Thus, Death in June is the easier of the two to get into. Whereas with Current 93, with David Tibet's approach, it's way more abstract and experimental to the point that it's really not following the rule book of musical understanding by the everyday listener. Instrumentally speaking, there's really not any hooks or rhythm sections. It's kind of something that kind of goes and does its own thing. It's way more abstract, as I stated. And the way David Tibet sings, if you want to call it that, is, again, not in the traditional sense. It's more of like this singing, talking. I believe it's pronounced as like Sprechgesang, which is German for like singing, talking, I'm pretty sure. And it's more of like this narrative output on how David Tibet does his vocals. It's not so much of like I'm trying to sweep you off your feet with how I sing, but more of like this narrative preacher-like approach that always feels as if he's trying to warn you that something urgent is going to happen. Again, getting more into that like apocalyptic folk genre tag that I talked about earlier on in this video, that if I'm looking for more of the ambitious, left field, and unorthodox approach within neo-folk that's, again, way more experimental, then I tend to listen to Current 93 more often than Death in June. Regardless of what you consider to be better or worse, or which one stands out more to you, Both of these projects, Death in June and Current 93, were extremely vital to the development and really just understanding of what neofolk is today. I do feel like if you truly want to appreciate neofolk, you want to become a fan of it, and you just want to know, the basic 101 knowledge of what this genre is all about, you need to know Douglas Pierce and David Tibet, as they are really the forefathers to what this genre of music would become. During the 1980s and 1990s, Douglas P. and David Tibet brought out the best within each other, because even though Current 93 is David Tibet's project and Death in June is Douglas P.'s project, they would often do guest appearances on each other's body of work. Albums that are great examples of this, plus are just essentials within neofolk, would come from Death in June with Wall of Sacrifice, But What Ends When the Symbols Shatter, and Rose Clouds of Holocaust. And on Current 93, you have Swastikas for Naughty, Earth Covers Earth, and Thunder Perfect Mind. Another interesting component that I've noticed with these particular albums and time period for both Death in June and Current 93 is that you'll notice that even though it's Douglas P. and David Tibet doing guest appearances on each other's body of work, it's all the musicians that they share. Almost like there's this big collective of individuals that were a part of Death in June and Current 93 that weren't like official members, but were clearly in like the inner circle that would be utilized whenever they released albums. It's like as if Douglas P. and David Tibet were aware of what they can contribute as musicians, they're aware of their limitations, and they're also aware of what other musicians could add to their body of work. Thus it would expand upon and really push ambitions, I feel like, within any of the albums I've named or any of the albums that were released during this time period. Such musicians that you'll notice pop up multiple times would be Rose McDowell, Stephen Stapleton, Tony Wakeford, Boyd Rice, and Michael Cashmore, just to name a few. Realizing all of this within neofolk, it's a huge reason as to why when I'm asked what I think is the greatest neofolk album ever made, I'll always go to Nature and Organization with the 1994 album Beauty Reaps the Blood of Solitude as the magnum opus of anything to do with this style of music, because it just genuinely feels like this monumental piece of an all-star cast of everyone who made neofolk special in what it is today, all coming together with their efforts and talents to make this just incredible piece of music. While it's often credited that Michael Cashmore did all of the songwriting within it, you got to give it up to everyone who participated and put in their efforts and talents and execution on the album. Again, from Michael Cashmore, David Tibet, Douglas P., Rose McDowell, Stephen Stapleton, again, Mark Allman from Soft Cell is a part of this. Just so many talented individuals all coming together to, again, as I stated, make this monumental piece that must be heard by any and all people interested in understanding what neofolk is all about. It's a gorgeous yet terrifying album. It just embodies everything that you can get from this style of music and then some. It's really one of the very few albums within this style of music of neofolk that it just sounds larger than life, where everything else feels a bit more grounded and low energy, and you kind of get more of like that occultish sense with neofolk. This one just feels a lot larger and grander, I feel like, and maybe that's why I have such an appreciation for it, along with just all of the, again, guest spots on this album. It just feels like every moment there's something special happening on it, and I can't emphasize it enough. This is a must listen. Shortly after, the friendship between David Tibet and Douglas P. would abruptly end. From what it's rumored that most people speculate is the reason for that, is that during the late 90s, I believe, David Tibet would befriend and I believe even work with, in some sense, Tiny Tim with some of his work. And that was a big no-no for Douglas P., as Tiny Tim is a massive homophobe, surprisingly enough, and Douglas P., as most of you know, is a gay man, and Douglas P. wouldn't put up with it, which again, it's kind of surprising that that would be the breaking point for Douglas P., considering all of the themes that he kind of sings around with and all the ideas that he would do with David Tibet, that would be the breaking point. Regardless, from what I understand, that's the main reason for it. Since then, I know they haven't really ever worked with each other since. I know if you want to get represses of any old Death in June albums, that's never going to happen, as David Tibet has guest spots on it and he doesn't want to repress it. And I believe the same would go for a lot of current 93 albums during this time, as they wouldn't get repressed, as, again, David Tibet wants nothing to do with anything Douglas P was affiliated with. That's my understanding with it. From what I also understand too, both of them are still making music to this day. I mean, Current 93 released an album only 2 years ago, and Death in June, I know his latest full length was called Essence, I believe, from like 2018 if I'm not mistaken, and I know 2 or 3 years ago he did a remix of Nada, which is a little odd, but again, both of them are still making music to this day. It's just for the past, over the past 2 decades, they've just never worked or even spoken to each other since. Now, I've spent a lot of time and energy just talking about Death in June and Current 93, mainly because they are so incredibly vital, as I've stated numerous times now, to the development, appreciation, and understanding what neofolk is all about. They basically influenced a whole other generation to experiment with folk music. That is undeniable. Regardless of what search engine you look it into of neofolk, I can guarantee you the first 2 results will always be Death in June and Current 93, no matter what, and it needs to be stated even within this video. But obviously there's a lot more to the history of neofolk than just David Tibet with Current 93 and Douglas P with Death in June. Another crucial project to the development of neofolk that I mostly breezed by through in this video so far would be Soul Invictus, mainly composed by Tony Wakeford. Now, I brought this individual up previously before in this video, as Tony Wakeford worked with Douglas P from Death in June for a little bit, as the first 3 Death in June albums were, again, a band, and Tony Wakeford was a part of it. Plus, he was also in Crisis with Douglas P during that time in the 70s. Now, Soul Invictus basically is instrumentally the same thing almost, or very adjacent to the kind of like song structure of that of Death in June, mainly why they're mostly compared to each other. It's just, I've kind of noticed with Soul Invictus, instrumentally, you'll notice between some of the albums, there's more of like this classical type of instrumentation kind of embedded within some of the songwriting you'll notice in Soul Invictus albums. However, the reason why I do believe Soul Invictus is often appreciated for what it did with the history of neofolk, but kind of ignored in some sense, is it mainly has to do with most of the controversy with Tony Wakeford, as even though, oddly enough, Tony Wakeford and Douglas P met each other at an anti-fascist rally, Tony Wakeford would later on become very far right-leaning, as he would then be a part of the National Front for a few decades, but denounced this viewpoint later on around the mid-2000s, stating that it was one of his biggest regrets that he ever did being a part of the Nationalist Front, and since then has just denounced any like far-right leanings. Regardless of how you look at that, if it deserves to be acquitted, or you can get into Soul Invictus, overall in the historical aspect of things with the timeline of neofolk, Soul Invictus is another important group that must be mentioned. As one can imagine, as the years go on until we reach the mid-90s up into the turn of the millennia, a lot more bands and artists are being influenced by the neofolk scene of the 80s and early 90s. One of the earliest examples that kind of was influenced by neofolk and propelled it in a different direction would be Blood Axis with their full-length album, The Gospel of Inhumanity. While in some aspects it does have a strong resemblance to neo-folk with the acoustic instrumentation and all the electronics and industrial aspects being melded together, what makes this quite the standout and kind of pushing neo-folk in different directions is there's a strong usage of martial industrial embedded within its songwriting. Regardless if you consider this martial industrial or neo-folk, The overall presentation that this album always gave off that pushed at least neofolk in some sense is it just gave off so much more of like this dystopian vibe and atmosphere within the whole album, regardless of what track you listen to, that it's just so colossal and grim, which is something to point out here. During the mid-90s onwards to the turn of the millennia, neofolk was having more of like these martial industrial groups being blended together of this hybrid, which I believe kind of makes sense when you look at the aesthetics being presented to the listener by Death in June, as a lot of it was Douglas Peace's fascination with World War II and the military, so that aesthetic kind of bleeding through now with martial industrial, which is just militarized industrial music, along with the fact that neofolk, as I stated earlier, is a form of folk and industrial being blended together. So why not now blend that industrial with martial industrial? So I can understand the adjacent kind of sides kind of bleeding through in this more of this parallel execution standpoint. So obviously there's stuff like Blood Axis, which would be kind of like one of the earliest examples of more of like a martial industrial neofolk. From there on you would get stuff like Aller Zealand, Order Rosaris Equilibrio, and I've even seen people characterize that Dernier Volonté is a form of neofolk, which I'm kind of a bit surprised by that he's often characterized as neofolk. Maybe it's because there's forms of some acoustic instrumentation with a lot of the electronic and industrial that he utilizes, but I've always looked at Dernier Volonté way more rooted in military pop or martial pop or what have you, but maybe that's just my personal bias getting the better of me here, but I can kind of understand a little bit as to how Dernier Volonté is neo-folk in this aspect. But as to what I would state is a great project to check out that carried over the sounds and instrumentation of Death in June for a new audience would be Of the Wand and Moon. Kim Larson, the main composer behind Of the Wand and Moon, has stated numerous times that he's highly influenced by Death in June, and it's really obvious when you listen to really any album that he's released. Instrumentally, it has that very straightforward acoustic guitar playing approach, with the singing that resembles a lot of the vibe, tone, and execution of Death in June. I will state, however, what makes Of the Wand and Moon a bit different, has at least somewhat of a signature sense to it, is that there's a lot more of this kind of like goth rock and psychedelic rock influences embedded into his sound that makes for some really great music that I would state, if you want to get into neo-folk, Of the Wand and the Moon is a great place to start as well. As for North America, there really wasn't that much activity happening in the United States for resemblance of neo-folk emerging, as a majority of it obviously was coming from the UK, although it is cited that some of the earliest examples of North American neo-folk would come from Swans, with albums such as White Light of the Mouth of Infinity and Love of Life that aren't explicitly neo-folk, but they resemble a lot of its characteristics. Although it is worth mentioning that what is considered by many as the first neo-folk band to form in the United States would be Backworld. Backworld's Anthems from the Pleasure Park is an incredible album that I would recommend to anyone as well. And one thing I've noticed different between neo-folk from North America and what was happening overseas in the UK is that American neo-folk is nowhere as abrasive, it's nowhere as experimental or abstract like some of the works that you'll find that was happening in the UK. It's a lot more grounded, it's a lot more lush and vibrant and welcoming, and even though it's still affiliated with the whole like apocalyptic folk genre tag, it doesn't feel as urgent in a sense. There is some, I guess, dark tones with the overall lyrical themes it's presenting, but it always just felt so much more lush and comforting. The psychedelic aspects about it don't feel as trippy, but more as if I'm being engulfed in nature itself. I don't know, it's just, I've always looked at American neo-folk as it's just more welcoming with it, and Backworld really kind of like laid out the blueprints for other American neo-folk projects to kind of continue on with this more lush aspect. Some noticeable names that carry that approach of American neo-folk would be Lux in Eterna, Cradle of Judah, Blood and Sun, a personal favorite of mine, of course, Ozzy and the Jupiter, and I'd even argue to a certain extent that Woven Hand kind of gets into that territory. Even though I know that's more rooted within like country music, some of their material kind of dives into like neo-folk territory as well. But as we reach the turn of the millennia into the 21st century, neo-folk doesn't really have a particular scene or area that it specializes in anymore. If anything, you'll tend to notice now it's flourished in many different directions. First example that comes to mind would be Agalloch with their 2002 album, The Mantle. Because what I find interesting about it is while Agalloch is rooted within black metal when they started out, when you get to this particular album and you start reading reviews and people appreciating it online, they always describe it that it's a black metal album, or it's a doom metal album, or even a folk metal album. They're so interested on the metal aspect about it, mainly metal fans are, which I understand, but when you hear Agalloch describe this album and their writing process and their influences creating this album, with some influences obviously like, Current 93, Soul Invictus, and Death in June, what this album really is instrumentally is it's an extreme metal version of a neo-folk album is basically what it is. And blending the two worlds together seamlessly, I can totally understand as to why over 20 years later, people admire the living hell out of it, and it's still an incredible piece of music that should be admired to this day. I also started to notice that neo-folk influence would find its way into forms of punk music. One band that's really stood out to me that I discovered recently would be Holy Locust, a very new punk rock band that's only been active for I think like 5 or 6 years, but what they've released is some really killer stuff, as it's punk rock blending like bluegrass and forms of dark folk within their sound that's very upbeat and honestly very, very energetic. How they're able to utilize all the string instruments of a cello and a violin and forms of acoustic instrumentation that just makes it so fun to listen to, that I think it's probably one of the most fun experiences I've had listening to anything that resembles forms of neo-folk or dark folk. Then of course there's Cult of Youth with their album With Open Arms, released in 2022, my album of the year for that respected year of 2022, as this album blew me away. Now Cult of Youth has always played around with elements of punk rock and forms of experimental folk music. They've always done that. But with this particular album, they hit it out of the park. It is so incredible. It's such an odyssey of different styles of music being blended together, but it flows so perfectly. This is an album that is meant for people who enjoy really any forms of music, but if you are a fan of either punk rock and or neo-folk, it's an absolute must listen. And of course I want to include Kiss the Anus of a Black Cat with their album from 2010, Hewers of Wood and Drawers of Water. Kiss the Anus of a Black Cat, god-awful band name, yet they make terrific music. From what I understand, Kiss the Anus of a Black Cat, their band name, is in reference to like some Danish ritual, apparently. Whatever the case, still a god-awful band name. But do not let that steer you away from checking their music out, because on this particular album, really everything they did prior to it in 2010, what Kiss the Anus of a Black Cat does is it's very adjacent to neo-folk. It's just the pacing, the singing, the overall songwriting, and really energy you get is punk rock or forms of like folk rock. It's really strongly embedded because it's one of the very few neo-folk tagged bands that actually is a band with, a full set of bass guitar, a vocalist, and an actual like drum percussionist. It's not just one guy hitting one single tom. There's like actually percussions of an acoustic drum set being played here. And I've always had such fun listening to this band because of that punk rock energy being clearly showcased with every song you'll listen to. It's just executed in the sense of neo-folk and dark folk, that overall it's just a very fun listen. But as for some of the bigger names that are really carrying the torch for neo-folk or getting that style being thrown around among a wider audience, I think the biggest band right now going that gets the most amount of attention that's new would be Rome. Mainly composed by Jerome Reuter, Rome has always had this much more larger-than-life aspect to how neofolk's being played with this overall instrumentation. Again, neofolk is way more rooted on a lower scale in terms of presentation, atmosphere, energy, and the overall execution and songwriting. Rome changes that to just be a lot larger, louder, and grander. I've always stated that Rome is basically the equivalent to what stadium neofolk would sound like. Now, Rome has a very large discography, and there are so many tremendous albums worth checking out, especially during the 2010s. All of it is just top-notch stuff. But I'll recommend the fan favorite, the album that gets them the most amount of attention, that being A Passage to Rhodesia. That, as I stated, it's a great representation of that larger-than-life stadium neofolk that I characterize it under. That, as I stated, I think Rome has really introduced a lot more people to what neofolk is capable of, and having, again, that accessibility with it, because it really gets to more of this anthemic type of singing approach and instrumental approach that a lot of people would admire. I would also cite Chelsea Wolfe as one of the more bigger names that flirts around with neofolk. While she isn't explicitly a neofolk artist diving more into the realms of a lot of experimentation, even metal to a certain extent with some albums, and other forms of ambience and industrial, make no mistake about it, she still plays around with like dark folk and experimental folk, which is basically adjacent, or is to an extent just neofolk, just rebranded to a certain degree. But yeah, some of her albums definitely is heavily embedded to what neofolk is accustomed to hearing. Again, she's gained quite the audience throughout the years. Borderline, I would state that she's kind of in the realms of like mainstream to a certain extent with the reach that she's capable of doing. And I would state, as of right now, one of the biggest names, again, flirting or playing around with neofolk, is definitely Chelsea Wolfe. As for the final inclusion of these bigger names that are affiliated with neofolk, I guess I would have to give it to Hailong, which I know is a bit blasphemous, not because they're bad or they've done anything wrong. It's just when you compare Hailong to the originators of neofolk, there really isn't any connection other than just maybe aesthetics, and that's kind of pushing it with like the whole like neo-paganism that they're both going for. It's just, again, what they're playing around with is folk music. It's experimental with the electronic music they're kind of playing around with. It's just so many other things are being developed over it with like these neo-paganist types of influences and aesthetics and themes that it's going on with, that it's completely developed into something totally different. But there's still that essence of neo-folk, you know, scattered around with what they're doing. And I would state that, again, stuff like Hailong, even Wadruna to a certain extent, are some of like the bigger names right now affiliated with it. In conclusion, neofolk has always fascinated me, with this massive juxtaposition of ideas of things that are natural and unnatural, organic and synthetic, being blended together to make something completely abnormal but also familiar at the same time. Whether it be more rooted in the traditional sense of folk music with the subtle experimentations going off with the electronic moments that I still find to be absolutely engaging, to the more abstract, unnatural, and weirder senses with like the subtleties of the normal acoustic instrumentations. No matter how it's being blended together, it's always just fascinated me how these two opposite worlds meet and find like common ground with how they're being melded together. It's just something that feels limitless. It's something that I feel like would intrigue any music listener that's looking for, you know, familiarity but also experimentation, or things that are abstract but also kind of easy to get into. Neo-folk is that genre of music I would always recommend. And that'll do it for this video, guys. Like always, links provided to everything I talked about will be in the description below. Really curious to know what you think of Neofolk and what other artists that I could have talked about in this video that I didn't, because I didn't want to drag this on forever. And that is that. So like always, guys, make sure you guys drink plenty of water to stay hydrated, and have a great day.